Hey everybody, Ethan here. Today I'm going to talk about serotonin-norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, also known as SNRIs. But I want to start by talking about Transformers. The motto of the Transformers franchise is more than meets the eye. And I've always loved Transformers and this motto because I always believed, or at least wanted to believe, that it applied to myself. You see, growing up as a young kid, and even to this day, it's clear what meets the eye, right? We got a short, nerdy, unassuming Asian kid here. And back when I did debate, you got to understand, these debates were like verbal fisticuffs, big time brawls, except much lamer. So intimidation and psyching people out played a big role in debate, in the same way it would in a fight. And if we take a look, with my messy bowl cut, soft smile, and zipper tie, the truth is, when I stepped into a debate, there really was no intimidation factor I could reasonably say that I possessed. The only thing I could intimidate at the time, and still today, is a small chihuahua, and even that, unfortunately, is a stretch. But the truth is, there was and is more to me than what met the eye, and you all know this from watching my videos, or at least this video. There's my exceptionally poor judgment, my annoying, immature, and grating sense of humor, and my tendency to blab on nonstop about nonsense like I'm doing right now. And what all of this meant was that, justified or not, I felt like and feel like I identify with underdogs, with those who were slept on and passed over. And that's really what brings me to SNRIs, which I see as the underdogs of the antidepressant landscape. SNRIs may very well not get the attention, common knowledge, and sheer number of prescriptions that SSRIs do, but I still see them as fascinating drugs worthy of prescription. Goodness, what a bit of a slip there, worthy of discussion. And you can see here on this list of antidepressant sort of prescriptions, these SNRIs really are not at the top of the list. And I do want to admit, this attempt to sort of tie this lame story to the topic at hand here is far from perfect. It's questionable. But let's be honest, when are my analogies and stories not questionable at best? The point is at best to elicit some pity laughs, and you all can sort of be the judge of that. But enough of this, enough of that. Let's focus on what we're going to talk about today, which is SNRIs, and the sort of three questions I hope to answer. What are the serotonin, norepinephrine, or noradrenaline transporters? How do SNRIs affect these transporters, and what are the indications for SNRI use? And just right off the bat, in addition to my tendency to mispronounce things, I want to say that norepinephrine transporter and noradrenaline transporters are sort of interchangeable. They are sort of synonyms. I'm going to use norepinephrine from here on out, but I just want to sort of touch that from right at the beginning. Let's talk about these transporters, or how they're abbreviated SCRT and NET. Before I do talk about the transporters, I want to talk about what they transport, which is the two important neurotransmitters of serotonin, seen on the left here, and norepinephrine, seen here on the right. Looking at their chemical structure, because I was an organic chemistry TA, got to start there, you can see that they share a single amine group in common, which is why they are both considered monoamines, a sort of class they fall under. Starting with norepinephrine. Norepinephrine really plays various roles all over the nervous system. It first works as a hormone in the sympathetic nervous system released by the adrenal glands, but it also works as a neurotransmitter in the sympathetic chain neurons, seen here on the left. It also works as a neurotransmitter in the CNS. Here on the right, we see areas where these norepinephrine cell bodies, or norepinephrine releasing cell bodies, are found, mostly in and around the brainstem, but they project all over many cortical areas in the brain and do affect cortical function in a wide variety of ways. Norepinephrine really does a lot of complicated things I'm not going into in detail, but broadly, we have to understand that norepinephrine's role in preparing the body for action via increases in sympathetic tone, as we see here on the left, is paralleled by what norepinephrine does in the CNS. Norepinephrine's action in the CNS helps increase attention, form memories, and just broadly helps enhance the ability for the brain to respond to stimuli. When we're talking about serotonin, though, serotonin doesn't affect sympathetic tone in the same way that norepinephrine does, but it does share the fact that these serotonin-secreting cell bodies are located in and around the brainstem, seen here. They also project all over the cortex and brain. These projections go all over the CNS, and my professor even told us that it's reasonable to say that every neuron in the CNS is at least somewhat in one way or another regulated by serotonin. And serotonin, because of that wide variety of things it projects to, also has diverse functions and roles, affects sleep, learning, pain, memory, and much more. So that's sort of the background on the transporters. Let's talk about the transporters themselves. What do they actually do? Recall that in the CNS, norepinephrine and serotonin act as neurotransmitters, meaning that their action is a function of their presence and staying power in the synaptic cleft, seen here and here. long as you have these neurotransmitters in synaptic cleft and they're sort of viable, these neurotransmitters, norepinephrine and serotonin, can bind to these channels or receptors on the postsynaptic neuron and initiate postsynaptic action potentials. As such, regulation of the effect of these neurotransmitters is largely dependent on their reuptake, or movement from the cleft, seen here, back into the presynaptic rather than postsynaptic neuron, via transporters like NET, seen here, and SCRT, seen here. Because these neurotransmitters, norepinephrine and serotonin, that flux through these transporters, NET and SCRT, have such diverse functions that I talked about before: attention, memory, sleep, all sorts of stuff. We can also intuit that dysfunction of these transporters is also implicated in a diverse range of diseases. This is just from a basic, PubMed Google search. We see ton of potential disorders and dysfunction that is caused, or linked at least, to dysfunction at the serotonin and norepinephrine transporters that reuptake these neurotransmitters. So now that we sort of talked about the neurotransmitters and their transporters, I want to talk about the mechanism of SNRI drugs. But before I do that, I do want to start with sort of acknowledgement and admission. I want to acknowledge that broadly, while I will do my best to portray the mechanism and indications of SNRIs in a very clean-cut fashion, the reality is that we don't fully understand how psychiatric disorders such as depression work. And therefore, we can't conclusively say that we know how SNRIs treat disorders such as depression. Depression is clearly not just a simple deficiency of serotonin and or norepinephrine. Recent research has looked into the role of the hippocampus, has cast doubt on the role of serotonin deficiency itself on depression, and more. It's really an emerging area of research and inquiry that I lack any standing and or knowledge of to even dare to opine on in a video like this. So what I really just plan to do here is explain the basics of what we know about how SNRIs affect the CNS, and then explain what we use SNRIs for currently, caveating that our knowledge of both may change very soon. One more disclaimer: the SNRI class of drugs itself is not homogeneous. Each one has particularities, so as always, I'll be painting with a broad and imperfect brush. My brush is always broad and imperfect in these videos, but especially so, I think, in this one. Let's get into it. SNRIs, such as venlafaxine, seen above, interfere with the action of serotonin reuptake transporters and norepinephrine transporters discussed previously. By blocking these transporters, they increase the amount of serotonin and norepinephrine that sits in the synaptic cleft, allowing for the generalized enhancement and increase of serotonin and norepinephrine tone in the brain and CNS. But this increase is not equal, at least when we're talking about venlafaxine. Venlafaxine is about 30-fold more potent in regard to inhibiting serotonin transporter activity when compared against activity against the norepinephrine transporter. It also generally tends to act on serotonin first and then norepinephrine. As you increase the dose, generally it has more action against norepinephrine, and even at high doses, and interestingly, venlafaxine can even inhibit dopamine reuptake. Another SNRI, duloxetine, has similarly higher inhibitory activity against the serotonin transporter, but duloxetine has 10-fold more activity against that serotonin transporter compared to 30-fold of venlafaxine. So that's sort of mechanism in a nutshell, right? You are inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine. And at least in the case of these two drugs, you're really inhibiting more serotonin reuptake compared to norepinephrine uptake. But given sort of what we've talked about, and how that these neurotransmitters will therefore have an increased effect in the brain and CNS, I was sort of left with another question. Given that norepinephrine affects sympathetic tone, in addition to acting as a CNS neurotransmitter, would these SNRIs affect sympathetic activity because they are affecting norepinephrine reuptake? And the answer, after my limited research, says yes. Given that SNRIs would impact norepinephrine reuptake, it makes sense that we see more sympathetic activity, given that there isn't well-documented selectivity for any specific norepinephrine transporters in terms of SNRIs. So in a nutshell, sort of, more norepinephrine, more sympathetic activity. And obviously, though, it's not that simple. Even though we see this sentence here, these SNRIs may increase sympathetic nervous system activity and decrease vagal tone, I'm sure that more research will come out soon that may render this irrelevant or flat out wrong, or at least give us more understanding of the mechanisms by which this may happen, which may be more complicated than I'm sort of illustrating here. More norepinephrine, more sympathetic activity. I'm almost certain it's much more complicated than that. But what I hope this sort of illustrates is that this sort of makes sense from a mechanistic perspective, given what we've explained about norepinephrine and SNRI's action to sort of block reuptake and increase that amount of norepinephrine that sits in the synaptic cleft. It's a nice little proof of concept, if you will. Lastly, I do want to talk about what we use these drugs for and sort of their indications. And really, it's mostly psychiatric conditions. The two SNRIs we've talked about today, duloxetine and venlafaxine. So venlafaxine, its trade name is Effexor, and duloxetine, trade name Cymbalta. They have a number of FDA-approved indications, most prominently for sort of psychiatric conditions, right? We have major depressive disorder for both, generalized anxiety disorder for both, social anxiety disorder, and panic disorder for Effexor, and generally, we see that sort of psychiatric conditions are being treated by these drugs, and that sort of makes sense from a 30,000-foot view, right? Because we understand that these neurotransmitters, serotonin and norepinephrine, do affect, attention, mood, and cortical function broadly. So ideally, modulating those through these drugs would theoretically help modulate these conditions as well. However, I do want to point to the effects on pain seen here for Cymbalta or duloxetine, fibromyalgia, diabetic peripheral neuropathic pain. That sort of doesn't click with what we've talked about so far. So let me explain. Given, again, what we understand, which isn't something that we've understand fully. Again, this is not fully understood. It's a phrase I've been using ad nauseum today. I know, but generally what we understand is that norepinephrine activity is associated with pain control, in that these norepinephrine helps process pain or affects how pain is processed. So these interventions to affect norepinephrine levels are theorized to explain why SNRIs help treat stuff like diabetic neuropathic pain. These interventions thereby, because of their effects on processing pain through affecting norepinephrine, help us treat pain. But again, qualified, we don't really understand how they work. And on that note, what I hope you take away from all of this is that my conviction regarding the specifics of the mechanisms by which SNRIs work is not high. There's a lot we don't know. And critically, what we do know about SNRI's mechanism, specifically its blocking of reuptake of these neurotransmitters, is not known definitively to contribute to the therapeutic effect that these SNRIs possess. However, what we do know that SNRIs enhance the action of norepinephrine and serotonin neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters have wide-ranging diverse actions throughout the CNS and beyond. And that, at a very basic, broad level, is our best explanation for the function that these SNRIs have in treating neuropsychiatric conditions. Unfortunately, the evidence base that these drugs possess is not the strongest, and that's sort of complicated the fact also that the evidence base for how we understand these conditions isn't the strongest either. But nonetheless, these are widely used and generally viewed as effective. So today, what we talked about are three things. We talked about the transporters, SCRT, NET, which reuptake serotonin and norepinephrine from the synaptic cleft into the presynaptic neuron. We talked about the mechanism of SNRIs, or at least what we understand about it, in that they block the action of these transporters, preventing reuptake and increasing the concentration and duration of these neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft. And lastly, we talked about indications. It depends on the specific drug, but generally they do treat psychiatric conditions such as MDD and GAD. And some of these drugs do treat pain or chronic pain due to their effect on norepinephrine, which is theorized or believed to affect pain processing in the brain and CNS. I hope this at least was somewhat informative and helpful, maybe engaging. Here are the citations I used for this video. I wish you all the best. Take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye.